Hello, everyone. We are back here in connection from Berlin, and we are starting the panel targeted by surveillance, Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and network repression. I'm very happy to welcome the people, the great people that are here with me. Stella Assange, Kevin Gosztola, and Stefania Maurizi, that will also moderate later the discussion. I want to first say a few words about this panel. That is the panel before the screening of the film Ithaka. We decided to have this very important discussion in the context of our conference, Smart Prison Tracking, Monitoring and Control, because we know about the pervasive surveillance, the monitoring and personal control that has oppressed Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for more than 10 years. And the condition around Assange's incarceration at the Belmarsh high security prison in the United Kingdom are really terrible. So we want to denounce this situation. We want to speak about, we want to make the voice heard, because we also think it's a complete injustice that this is happening. And this is also a really difficult situation if you think about that this case sets an extremely dangerous precedent for journalists, media organization, and freedom of the press. So we have to think about that we have to support Julian, but we also have to support the people that have the courage to speak out and tell the truth. And in connection to that, before starting the panel, I would like to call on stage the people that are part of the group Berlin for Assange, because we think it's very important also to make this struggle together, and what happens also in the territory, in the grassroots movement, gives strength to fight this kind of injustice. So I would like to call them here with me on stage to also explain what they're doing in Berlin, which initiative they're preparing for the people to join. So welcome. You can go there.
Yeah, hello. I just want to announce very shortly what we do. We are just ordinary people who want to help to spread the message about this important case. And yeah, I know here are many people who are working in a different way, but we just want to tell you what we do. And yeah, we are every week 10 hours in front of the Brandenburg Gate. And we try to do like a presentation with information. We give people information and show the cell of Julian, also the size of Julian Assange's cell. And yeah, there are different days. Sometimes we only have a few conversations, but sometimes we have spontaneously a group of students we can talk to. And so I think it's worth it to spread the message somehow further. And yeah, it can still be improved. So we are working on how to present important information there. And there are also people who take pictures and who really read this information. And we meet many people on the street who have not been in contact with all this stuff before. And if you want, you can help us to improve what we can present there, like helping us with design or putting together information. And we are also working on what can we give people to make them get in contact with this topic. So we're inviting people to take picture with us, or we have little cards with the address of Belmarsh prison and tell them that they can send a letter. You can also have some little flyers over there. And we are, yeah, giving them stickers. And yeah, maybe there are other creative ideas we could also use. So just tell us if you have an idea. And one last thing is we have a connection with the Akut Kino. This is showing now every month at least 2 documentaries on the Assange case. We have also some flyers there, and we distribute flyers for this event. And yeah, you can also come by and distribute our material or give us material which is also in connection with this case, and we could distribute there. So this is, yeah, what we want to say.
And by the way, we are standing right in front of the US Embassy, so we want to show them that we are still present and we will not forget Julian Assange.
Thank you. So I'm now introducing the speakers of the panel, and then I will leave it to them. First, Stella Assange is Julian Assange's wife and a lawyer based in the UK. She met Julian Assange in London in 2011 when she joined the international legal team, his international legal team, including during the asylum period in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and his incarceration in the Belmarsh prison. They have 2 children together and also married in March 2022 in the Belmarsh prison. And Kevin Gosztola is a journalist and Dissenter newsletter editor. He has spent the last decade reporting on Assange, Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks, and the wider world on whistleblowers, particularly in the US. He's the co-founder and managing editor of Shade of Proof, an independent news outlet focused on systemic abuses of power in US governments and by US corporations. He's the author of Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange that just came out. So you can find it at the entrance as well. We are selling the book of Kevin, and you are free to buy it. Also, Stefania just published a book that you can find at the entrance. Stefania Maurizi is an Italian investigative journalist working for the Italian daily Il Fatto Quotidiano after 14 years working for L'Espresso and La Repubblica. She has worked on all WikiLeaks secret files, and she is also the only journalist who has conducted the FOIA litigation in US, UK, Australia, and Sweden to access the full documentation of the case. In her book, Secret Power, WikiLeaks and Its Enemies, from Pluto Press, she reconstructs the Assange and WikiLeaks case. As I say, if you are interested, also you can buy the book of Stefania at the desk. Now I leave it to you, and we will start with the presentation by Stella. And I really want to thank all of you for being here. Also, Stella, it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here at the Disruption Lab. And thanks a lot for your struggle, your fight, and we are all with you in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and I was very interested in the approach that the smart prisons opened up for me to talk about Julian's case as a theme, because I really think that Julian's case is emblematic of our times in many different respects. And thanks to Kevin and Stefania and their work of actually plotting out the way this conspiracy to imprison Julian has panned out over the years, and really done a forensic analysis with the documents in Stefania's case, and analyzed the political case in Kevin's case. It kind of frees my hands a little bit, because what I've been doing for some years is retelling a lot of detail and kind of establishing the facts. But now there are books out there that do that, which I can just reference. And a third book is also Niels Meltzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, whose book, The Trials of Julian Assange, I also highly recommend. So I spend a lot of time talking about kind of the big picture on Julian's case. And I do that in different contexts, not least to our children who are 4 and 5 years old, and also to an audience that is probably not as tuned into the case as you probably are. And I return to this, how telling Julian's case is of not just where we are right now, but of the trajectory of the past 13 years. And you can see this from the perspective of, from the press freedom perspective, where you have someone who actually lived up to the potential, who created a means to get the press to be really effective in holding abusive powers to account, or at least exposing them. The second stage of that, the accountability stage, is where there has been a failure because those powers remain impune. So Julian has been punished for doing the right thing, for bringing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to its logical conclusion, of having a strong press that holds powers to account, of exposing abuses, and of making a democratic population informed and able to use the information to be able to expose those powers. And Julian is probably the only person who is currently in prison over the Iraq War for having exposed the abuses of the Iraq War. Julian's punishment started in 2010. And when you think about Julian's case, you have to understand that there's an extraordinary sophistication through which he has been made to suffer. Administrative sophistication to justify the ill treatment and the torture. So the best way to look at it is to see what the true state of his situation is. And the true state of his situation is that he has not been a free man since the 7th of December 2010. That's the day that he was first arrested. He initially spent 10 days in prison, and then a year and a half under extremely oppressive house arrest, where he had to report to a police station every day, and he had to be inside a house for 12 hours out of the day, and his movements were restricted and so on for a year and a half. And then he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy and stayed within the embassy walls for about 7 years, until the British police arrested him after the Ecuadorian government illegally and unilaterally withdrew the political asylum that the previous government had recognized. And that's where Julian remains, 4 years. On the 11th of April, it will be 4 years inside Belmarsh High Security Prison. Now, Belmarsh High Security Prison is the MI5 prison. It is the surveillance prison. And it is extremely restrictive, as you can imagine. It is the harshest prison in the UK. And we can go into the process that we have to go through in order to get in. But it enables Julian's every relationship, every communication, every habit to be monitored to the utmost degree. And that is the purpose of having him there. In addition to silencing him and disappearing him from public view. But it is to map out, as if he were a lab mouse, every single aspect of his life, of any relationship he wants to or can keep, is monitored throughout. And in a way, this is perhaps what might be expected of a high security prison like that, a surveillance prison like that. But I think it's very much on the same spectrum of what was happening inside the embassy. Similarly there, his movements were, his liberty was extremely restricted. He was in a flat of effectively about 100 square meters or less of space that he could actually use. There was no outside space. There were cameras everywhere. And over the years, as Ecuador became an agent for the United States secretly, the cameras pointing in started proliferating. And the ones that were pointing out became neglected and almost ignored. And the security company working within the embassy was in charge of monitoring Julian's relationships, communications, and habits. And they were taken down in extraordinary detail. And of course, we know all this because once Julian was arrested, several people who were working inside the security company in the embassy blew the whistle. And they went to Spanish El País, and then they went to Spanish police, and they handed over the evidence they had of the surveillance they had been conducting on Julian. And not just Julian, on me, on our 6-month-old baby, on Julian's lawyers. And it turned out that they were recording everything, that they had hidden recording devices under the fire extinguisher in the meeting room in the embassy, for example. There was a noise distorting machine there, but they had also installed a different device that canceled out the noise distorting machine. Every 14 days, they would physically transport a hard drive, or several hard drives, to the United States to physically hand it over to their handlers, who were the CIA. And then the last stage of this was the CIA operation in the United States. What is really extraordinary about Julian's case is that we know so much about the surveillance, partly through the whistleblowers in Spain who were working for the company and the Spanish court case that's underway, but partly also because of sources within the US national security establishment itself, who were willing to speak to journalists about what the Trump administration's Central Intelligence Agency under Mike Pompeo was planning and pushing for, particularly Mike Pompeo, in relation to Julian and WikiLeaks. And that was that they were planning for the kidnapping, rendition, and even assassination of Julian. And this was extremely noticeable that something really sinister was going on while we were in the embassy. So I thought, just to begin the discussion, I really think that what Julian has been through is part of a spectrum, the relationships, the communications, and the habits that were monitored. But in a way, I think we're all exposed. We're somewhere on this spectrum, right? All of our communications, relationships, and habits are monitored and able to be monitored. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stella. And also I want to say thank you to Tatiana and Danielle and all the organizers at the Disruption Network Lab. Thanks for inviting me and bringing me here from the United States, which is kind of a far way to come, but I'm really excited to be part of this discussion, this very important discussion. And as Stella was describing, for the past 10 to 15 years, the United States security state has engaged in tracking, monitoring, and control against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, against staffers of WikiLeaks, and essentially anyone who the agency is believed might be connected to WikiLeaks in some manner. And these people could be unimportant today, but tell you at some point in their lives 10 years ago, they were harassed or intimidated by the security state. There has been a grand jury investigation. It went through several phases. The Department of Homeland Security tracked the travel of well-known WikiLeaks associates or supporters of Chelsea Manning. This is the U.S. Army whistleblower who gave the documents that are at issue in this case, what Julian is being punished for. In 2010, Joe Lieberman pressured Amazon to remove WikiLeaks from the cloud services. PayPal blocked WikiLeaks. Then Post Finance in Switzerland blocked WikiLeaks, and then Visa, and then MasterCard joined this growing blockade. Donations to WikiLeaks were blocked by Bank of America, and Bank of America was also found later to be engaged in a kind of smear campaign where they were exploring through this small amateurish firm called HB Gary ways that they could sow division among people who were WikiLeaks supporters. U.S. magistrate judges authorized orders from the U.S. government, which mostly the FBI, to Twitter, Google, Dynadot, and Sonic.net for data from WikiLeaks associates, including Icelandic parliamentarian Birgitta Jónsdóttir. This was during the presidency of Barack Obama. And Obama officials, they frequently called themselves the most transparent administration ever, while perfecting a system of secrecy for the digital age that involved blocking torture photos, hiding documents on drone warfare and kill lists, and hiding videos of force feedings of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. More sources, media sources, were prosecuted than all previous presidents combined under the Espionage Act. This is the law. It's over 100 years old that Julian is being prosecuted under in the United States. They developed an insider threat program that gave it incredible capabilities to track and control national security employees. So I'll go to these slides now. Tech. Anyone want to tell me why I don't know how to use my machine? Let's see here. Let's do this. Technology is fun. Oh, this is the end. There we go. That'll fix it. And now we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, 10 years. So what we learned from Edward Snowden was that there was this manhunting timeline that existed within the security agencies, and they had a discussion about whether they could label an organization like WikiLeaks. You can also see the piratebay.org there as well. Could we label it a malicious foreign actor? Here's a preview of where things were going once we had Mike Pompeo, who was leading the CIA. And this is the kind of program they had that they were discussing. about targeted website monitoring was what they wanted to do. And here you can see the tool. This is a screenshot of the tool that they were using, and this came from Edward Snowden. So we get to the CIA, and as Stella was mentioning, there was quite a vengeance on the part of Pompeo to come after Assange and WikiLeaks, and that's primarily because of a publication of the Vault 7 materials in March 2017. And I'm not just saying that myself, that's been articulated by Mike Pompeo himself, both in his book about his time and the Trump administration, but also in the first speech that he gave as CIA director. And these files contain great detail about the cyber warfare and hacking capabilities of the CIA. These were methods that were for tracking, monitoring, and control, and now they were out in the open. You had a program like Weeping Angel that could attack Samsung televisions and turn them into spying devices. You had zero-day exploits that would allow the CIA to hack Apple's iOS devices like iPads and iPhones. You could target Signal and WhatsApp users, and some of this we knew to some degree because of the disclosures from the NSA, but what we saw is that the CIA had their own arsenal parallel to the NSA for targeting devices. One more remarkable revelation was that the CIA could steal this data from organizations by pretending to be other people from foreign countries. It could be China or Russia or any country for that matter. So this is Mike Pompeo, and as Stella said, he labeled WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service. This was a term that was created to justify a disruption campaign against WikiLeaks. And he's also, at some point, well, when he was Secretary of State, I think he had moved on from being the CIA director, he said something to the effect that we lied, we cheated, and we stole. And just to make the point, the reason I raise that is WikiLeaks doesn't steal secrets, but the CIA does. Yahoo News reporters, this is what Stella was talking about, these Trump sources. They talked to Yahoo News reporters, and we were able to find out that war plans were sketched out that allegedly included plots to kidnap or poison Assange. That's really going back to the CIA's roots, because they plotted to poison the toothpaste that Patrice Lumumba would use in the Congo when he was an anti-colonial leader. They also had many plots for Fidel Castro in Cuba, and they included poison as well. Objectives of the disruption campaign included, according to these sources, paralyzing WikiLeaks' digital infrastructure, disrupting WikiLeaks' communications, provoking internal disputes within WikiLeaks by planting damaging information, and stealing WikiLeaks members' electronic devices. But, and I think this is to the credit of WikiLeaks, apparently, according to these sources, they determined it would be too difficult to infiltrate the group because everyone is so security conscious. And they decided that it would be easier to try and sow division. So recently, at the end of February, and this is the article from Yahoo News, and recently Spiegel did a story, "Is the CIA hunting Assange supporters?" that explored the extent to which a disruption campaign may have been carried out. And Andy Miller-Magoon spoke to Spiegel. He's known for his work with the Chaos Computer Club, and he showed them an implant. It was 4 by 6 centimeters. It had a gold border with a welded-in double battery, and it was on the circuit board of his cryptophone. And it was fitted with a stainless steel cover over that, and that there was a serial number. The implant, a field programmable gate array, was made out of US chips, and he uncovered it by accident while he was in his Southeast Asia apartment in March 2018, about the time when we expect that this disruption campaign was really at its height. He had used the phone to communicate with Assange and other journalists. And he said, "They were in my private rooms. To be honest, that doesn't feel great." And he has helped make donations to WikiLeaks possible through the Walhallen Foundation, and he believes it is most likely that that's why they targeted him, to disrupt the flow of funds to WikiLeaks. One more individual, and then I'll wrap up. Ola Binney. He visited Assange at least 15 times in the embassy, and he found himself the subject of a criminal prosecution in Ecuador. For 8 hours, Ola told Spiegel he was held at the airport and not allowed to contact a lawyer in the Swedish embassy. Eventually, he found he was in a kind of detention center. He said, "I was put in a cell with 8 or 10 people and had to sleep on the floor." In prison, he was finally allowed to see a lawyer. He was accused of destabilizing the government, which is actually an honorable thing these days. They would provide the evidence later, said his defense attorney, and then later accused him of attacking computer systems. The case did eventually fall apart after several years, but obviously they were trying to drive him mad the same way they were engaged in the pressure campaign against Assange, this total surveillance campaign against Assange and everyone in the embassy. And he was tracked closely by individuals in what he believed were, they were, to him, security agents from some country who were following him around. So I'll go ahead and wrap up there, but I'll have more to say on this after Stefania's presentation.
Thank you. We need some. Okay. So thank you, Tatiana. Thank you, Disrupt the Berlin, for this event. So I'm here to tell you why you should care about this case. Not just because Julian Assange is a human being, even if the US and the UK authorities have done whatever they could to remove this information that he is a human being, but also because this case is unique. I have been a journalist for the last 22 years, 16 years of which in investigative journalism, 14 years of which intensely focus on the WikiLeaks case. Not on WikiLeaks alone, of course, but very intensely on it. Now, why would a journalist work 14 years on a case? Because this case is unique. It's unique both in terms of what WikiLeaks has done. They didn't just reveal classified documents. All national security correspondents do reveal secret information, classified information. They did something different. They basically ripped a gaping hole in what I call the secret power. It's not a conspiracy, secret power. You can call it the military-industrial complex, you know? The highest level of power, where the intelligence services, the diplomats, the state operates. And the ordinary citizen has no control over this secret power because she has no access to the secret information on how it operates. Actually, the ordinary citizen doesn't even perceive the importance, the relevance of this power for his life as an ordinary citizen. The ordinary citizen thinks, well, I'm a humble teacher in Berlin. Why I should care about the secret services when they will cross my life? But these people decide our lives, absolutely decides our life. You don't even perceive, but they do. So what WikiLeaks has done, and which is unique, is that for the first time in history, they have ripped a gaping hole in the secret power, giving billions of people systematic and unrestricted access to enormous archives of classified documents which reveal how our governments behave when completely shielded from public and media scrutiny. They prepare wars or commit atrocities. They torture people. It is exclusively for this activity that Julian Assange has never again known freedom. I remember the last time I met Julian, and he was a free man. It was in this city. It was 28 September 2010. He had just left Stockholm in a direct flight. He arrived very late in the evening to my hotel near close to Alexanderplatz, and he had no luggage. He had no luggage at all. His luggage had disappeared in this direct flight from Stockholm to Berlin. Clearly, he had been under surveillance and someone had stolen his luggage. From the very beginning, this story is about heavy surveillance of Julian, of the WikiLeaks journalists, and I would say all, his wife, his family, his children, doctors, lawyers, and we journalists. In 2015, I realized that he had spent 5 years confined, initially under house arrest, then basically inside the Ecuadorian embassy, and he had been arbitrarily detained for 5 years. No journalist had tried to get the documentation about the case. No one. And it was incredible to me. So I decided to try to get access to the documents. And I used a strategy. You always need a strategy. And the strategy was, if I can get documents from Sweden, which is quite open when it comes to government transparency, I can get documents from other jurisdictions which are less open. And these documents were released to me, very, very few of them, but crucial ones. And they allowed learning the answer to one of the key questions about the Swedish case. Why did the Swedish prosecutors, Marianne, who had reopened the rape case, refuse to question Julian Assange in London for 6 years, leaving him in limbo, where he was not charged for rape, but the case was not dismissed, so he was labeled as a rapist, but there were not even charges against him. And the answer was that it was the UK public authority called Crown Prosecution Service who had advised the Swedish prosecutors not to go to London to question Julian Assange. Now the Swedish case is out. It has been completely dropped. However, the Crown Prosecution Service is a key public authority when it comes to this case, because it is through the Crown Prosecution Service that the United States is acting to try to extradite Julian Assange to the United States. That's why we should focus on it. And this is one of the documents, key documents, which I obtained, which provide indisputable evidence that it was the Crown Prosecution Service which told the Swedish prosecutor not to go to London to question him. This is one of the famous emails I obtained through this FOI litigation, don't you get cold feet, when the press was suggesting that Sweden might drop the investigation. Why the Crown Prosecution Service behave like this? When I tried to investigate this, I discovered a very important information. The Crown Prosecution Service had destroyed key documents on this case, while the case was ongoing, highly controversial and high profile. You see the Crown Prosecution Service telling my lawyers that they had destroyed these documents. A month after discovering the destruction of documents, I went to the embassy. Julian was still in the embassy to discuss this. This is what was done to my phone secretly. It was opening too. The last time I met Julian inside the embassy was November 2018, 5 months before his arrest. I came out of the embassy and my then deputy editor at La Repubblica tried to call me for 2 days, tried to email me, tried to text me, tried to call me, and there was no way to reach me. My communications were completely isolated. The surveillance and the interception and the spying activities on us, on all of us, have been very intense from the very beginning. During my investigation based on FOIA, I discovered that not only the Crown Prosecution Service, but even the Swedish Prosecution Authority destroyed key documents on this case. Again, why? Why do you destroy? I mean, we are a country, Italy is a country where you have all sorts of legal scandal, but not even in Italy we ever had a scandal in which the very same public authority destroyed the documents. Maybe the documents disappear mysteriously, maybe, but not even in Italy we ever had such a situation. One of the things they destroyed was an FBI email in March 2017. In those months, the CIA was planning to kill or kidnap Julian Assange. Here you can see the Swedish Administrative Court confirming me that they destroyed this message and that the message came from an executive of the FBI and reached the Swedish Prosecution Authority in March, at the end of March 2017. These are official documents which I have obtained from people who have basically persecuted Julian Assange for over a decade, not from activists, from people sympathetic with Julian Assange. This FOI litigation has not just revealed information about Julian Assange, but also about three journalists who worked for WikiLeaks: Christine Rasson, Joseph Farah, and Sarah Harrison. These documents are in the hands of these entities called Counterterrorism Command of the Metropolitan Police. Maybe you have heard of the Metropolitan Police as Scotland Yard. This Counter-Terror Command, Terrorism Command, has this stated role: countering terrorism, countering threats posed to national security, protecting democracy from espionage, subversion, and political extremism. The correspondence is correspondence between Scotland Yard Counterterrorism Command and the US Department of Justice. It has been denied to me based on this rationale. It was supplied by or touches on a security body. The security bodies in the UK are the Security Service, which means MI5, the Secret Intelligence Services, which mean MI6, the Government Communication Headquarters, GCHQ, and many others. We know that in the case of WikiLeaks, it is MI5. This is one of the, one of the documents submitted by Scotland Yard. This is their, part of their witness statement at the FOI hearing. And they do not dispute that these three individuals are journalists. It is not in dispute that these three individuals are journalists. So they use national security laws against journalists as if they were Al-Qaeda operatives. And they do this openly, and no one has a problem. No one is reporting, no one cares. That's why I'm closing this panel. We are at the crossroads. If we allow the US government to put journalists in prison for life for revealing war crimes and torture, we will no longer live in a democracy where journalists have the right to reveal the dirty secrets of governments and the public has the right to know them. Thank you. Thank you. Now we want to have I want to ask some questions to Stella and Kevin, and then we welcome your question as well. Stella, how is Julian, first of all?
It's a difficult question to answer because it's a daily struggle, so every day is different. He's in decline. I mean, the general trajectory is of decline, of increasing deterioration of his health, both physical and mental. But every day brings on its own challenges. So it entirely depends on where we are with the case, what's happening inside the prison, what's happening with people he knows and cares about on the outside, people getting sick, people dying, you know. So he's a fighter, but obviously he's been there for a very long time.
This is also a story of a family, not just a couple. When you visit him with your kids, how does he interact with them?
Well, it's a joyful interaction. The kids are, as you can imagine, a 4- and a 5-year-old. Impossible to stop from running and running up to Julian. It's every time I go in, you know, it's very regimented. We have to go through many stops as we go in, and we get searched, and there's a dog search, and there's a search in, you know, we have to open our mouths, and they check us through with a magnetic wand and through an X-ray, and they pat us down and so on. But then once we're through the doors and into a hall that's about the size of this room, this hall, I have to do my fingerprints one last time before going to sit down at the table with Julian. And I open the doors and the kids just run to Julian, you know, they just run up to him. And they're, you know, sometimes I'm running after them because of course you have the security guards saying, "No, stop them, they can't run, no, we're gonna make you leave. They're not allowed to do that." And you know, like it can be quite comical where I'm trying to put my fingerprint on and shouting after them, and they're, you know, 15 meters ahead and already jumping on Julian's lap and so on. So yeah, whenever the kids are there, it's always lovely, and that's it's lovely for all of us to be together as a family. They can sit on his lap and he can read them stories, and we can be there for about an hour and a quarter. There's a little shop with, you know, not much on offer, but we can buy coffee and some chips and that kind of thing. And it's very much like a normal family in a strange way, even though all our interactions have always been in that hall for no more than an hour and a half at a time. But the kids, they love to go and see their father, and they go about once a week.
Great. I want to ask one last question. If you had the chance to appeal to President Biden directly, what would you tell him?
Well, I'd tell him to do the right thing, that he can't possibly want the worst aspects of the Trump administration legacy to be also his legacy, and that he's continuing down a road in which the United States it can no longer be considered a meaningful democracy if it puts publishers in prison for telling the truth. One of the most important aspects of the United States, one of its positive aspects is that it has had a robust press for a long time, but that's no longer the case. And that's why you have the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on saying in their editorials that this case is a case that attacks the First Amendment and their ability to publish freely. And the Biden administration should go back to the Obama administration's position and stop this prosecution.
Thank you. Thank you. Kevin, you have followed this case for over a decade. Have you seen any change on how the US public and the US media see this case?
That's a good question. Well, we have to talk about which media, because there are some people who do the work like we do as journalists to follow whistleblower cases, to follow WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and occasionally you do see some snippets and bursts of decent reporting, like the Yahoo News report in the United States was a rare example of people in what you could call the media establishment actually showing an interest in this. But I do think that there is a major defect in, and I call them the prestige media, because they're these organizations. I took this from a scholar named Jules Boykoff, but it's sort of because they see themselves as better than a lot of the dissenting groups out in the country, and they position themselves in such a way that we could also say that that's the way they're playing a gatekeeping role for the press in deciding what is important and what is not important to cover. But particularly in this case, when you look at the indictment, when you read the extradition decision by the district judge, Vanessa Baretzer, in the UK, you see examples there of media malpractice, of journalism playing a role in aiding the prosecution of Assange. And these same people who have found themselves in this position are doing nothing to remedy and fix the fact that they have some responsibility, because they could be further investigating what the US security agencies have done to Julian Assange, but they're not inquisitive. So we just see that The Guardian played a role in exposing Julian Assange to further prosecution because David Lee had to put the password in one of the titles of his chapters in his book, which was basically just him getting out his petty vendetta with Julian of not being happy with how that worked over the documents. You see CNN using the same exact documents that El País used to expose what was happening at the Ecuador embassy with total surveillance, but instead fitting it into a narrative in the US that, oh, they claim Julian was involved in making the embassy a Russian election meddling outpost, even though that's not what those documents from UC Global or anything reflected. It reflected what El País had to report, which was that there was total surveillance happening of journalists, doctors, and people who were coming in and handing over their electronic devices because they had no choice. If they wanted to meet Assange, they had to give those up.
Absolutely. Speaking about the UC Global, if we go back to 50 years ago, to the first time the US authorities persecuted whistleblowers for revealing horrific things about the Vietnam War, Daniel Ellsberg. In the case of Daniel Ellsberg, the espionage case collapsed. And the US authorities had done all sorts of abuses and crimes, from trying to kill him, using operatives to kill him, they spied on him, they illegally wiretapped. These are the very same things done against Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists, and Stella and family and so on. Why, in this case, the case hasn't collapsed, whereas in the case of Daniel Ellsberg, the case collapsed?
I believe it's because of a crisis that we find in a lot of countries in the world, where there's no accountability anymore for this corruption. we just marked the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, and nobody has been held accountable for it, even though you might have somebody who you would think would have some influence, like Hans Blix, the UN chief weapons inspector, saying that President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney and others should have been brought before some kind of a war crimes tribunal for what unfolded in Iraq. And I think to your question, it's really irrelevant here to insert the fact that there is an effort in the United States right now to deal with this surveillance that happened. There's a lawsuit that was filed against the CIA and former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, based upon the allegations that are known from some of these reports. But we just got the response from the US government recently, and I'd just like to read a couple of these. I won't take a long time, but they wrote that these journalists and attorneys, the four people who have taken on this lawsuit, who I could name, but they're basically all of us. There were hundreds of people who came in to the embassy that were American. It really doesn't actually matter if they're journalists or attorneys because the government does not differentiate. They say that these Americans had no legitimate expectation of privacy with respect to conversations they allegedly had with a notorious, wanted fugitive in a foreign embassy or in the exteriors of items voluntarily relinquished to embassy staff. I mean, Stefania can tell you about how voluntary it was to give up your device. Awesome. But anyways, the plaintiff, this group was also singled out because the government says that Assange is a person they knew was of interest to law enforcement agencies of more than one country, in a foreign embassy, a facility that houses ambassadors and other government officials, and mentions strict security protocols. And they go on to say that with respect to their subjective expectation of privacy, these Americans who visited allege only that they were unaware that their meetings with Assange were recorded and given to the CIA until they saw the El País article. They do not, however, allege specifically that they contemporaneously believed their conversation with Assange were private or what reason they had for such a belief. So, just so I can make sure we're all clear, what the United States government is saying about privacy rights is if you know that an authoritarian or totalitarian government is conducting surveillance against you, and even if it violates your rights, you know that someone was going to spy on you, so you can't go to court and say that you were injured or had damage done to you because you should have known you were going to be spied on. And there are already in my head a dozen contexts that I could come up with for why this would be a ridiculous way for us to organize human rights in the world.
It's like saying, you know that in Sicily there is mafia, so if they kill you, we don't proceed with any criminal case because you know that there is mafia, you know?
Right. Yeah. The other example that quickly comes to my mind is, oh, you were aware that the warlords control that part of the country, so to venture into it, you deserve whatever happened to you. The torture, the kidnappings, all of that, you knew that was going to happen.
Absolutely. My last question. So if we look back at the Pentagon Papers, to publish them required a legendary fight up to the US Supreme Court. And the case was won. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of these revelations. Now let's look at the Supreme Court in these days, in case Julian Assange gets extradited to the US. What do you expect from this Supreme Court?
I would expect that this Supreme Court would uphold the Espionage Act, would say that what the US government was doing was legitimate, which is really troubling. And I've been thinking a lot about Daniel Ellsberg, so have many people around the world, that have come into contact with him as a person who was a Pentagon Papers whistleblower, because he's coming to the end of his life. He's a 92-year-old man. He's going to be turning 92. He's been diagnosed with cancer, so he's concluding his life and going out as a great peace advocate, an anti-nuclear weapons activist, somebody who has been one of the biggest defenders of people like Julian Assange and whistleblowers throughout the world, and somebody who in the community you could turn to and talk with and get help privately as you were dealing with being targeted by the US government. And he's told me that I really did not win. He doesn't feel like he won in 1971. When the case collapsed, basically he feels he was spared. That if there hadn't been this corruption in the case where he was targeted, this burglary, they broke into a psychiatrist's office, if this hadn't happened, then he definitely would have been convicted and he would have gone to prison. And I think that gives us all the alarm bells that we need to understand why it's so important to keep fighting to get this case dropped. And part of having this conversation and part of raising what this argument is that the US government is now making about privacy rights of people and how that applies to journalists, attorneys, doctors, and people in all different contexts is to say that we need to wake up. And this isn't, as Stella said at the beginning, this is about Julian Assange and what's happening to him on a personal level and what he goes through individually. But if anybody out in the audience or anyone watching this live stream thinks that it's just Julian Assange that we care about when we have these discussions, they're wrong, because it affects hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people throughout the world, what the United States is perpetuating.
Thank you, Kevin. Now, thank you. Now, we want to hear from you, so we welcome your question.
Hi. Thank you very much for your ongoing work and for the talk here today. I just wanted to bring out this thing I read recently. I remember about 10 years ago, or just over 10 years ago, I heard a recording that had been done before Julian Assange went into the embassy, when he was in some cottage. And Eric Schmidt from Google went, and then they did some talk, and it was recorded, and I think the transcript is now on WikiLeaks. And even back then, because I just remembered recently, I was rereading some parts, and he was already mentioning the Espionage Act, of how this case could be constructed using the Espionage Act. So my question is, these kind of laws that they keep in silence, so they can use because all the other techniques, like character smear, inner division, all these have been used because he was also, the whole WikiLeaks ecosystem has really been able to fight very well, counterattack, and thus expose even bigger issues. But my question is, regarding these kind of laws like the Espionage Act, how can we tackle rolling back these kind of laws, or is this a possibility?
Thank you. Stella, do you want to reply?
Well, I think, first of all, not seeing the Espionage Act as something that is the US's problem because of the way it's being applied. It is the single greatest threat to press freedom globally, to journalists globally. I was just doing an interview earlier today, and speaking to the journalist, I said, well, okay, so it was an Italian journalist who works here in Germany, and I say, okay, imagine completely imaginary scenario, imagine You get documents evidencing, say, Morocco conducting a massacre in Sierra Leone. And then you publish it here in Germany, and then Morocco goes, we want you extradited, because we're not disputing that that evidence of the massacre was true, but that's a secret. And that's what states do, right, in cover-ups. They label the cover-up secret, because that's a necessity when you do a cover-up. So that information, regardless whether it was true, regardless whether it concerned an international crime, was captured by our secrecy laws, and our secrecy laws operate extraterritorially all over the world. In Germany, in China, in Botswana. That is the US's case against Julian. And that means there is no press freedom anywhere if the countries are not willing to enforce their press freedom protections. And so far, the UK, where Julian was when these documents were published, is not prepared to protect a publisher who is publishing from there. And the European Court of Human Rights will eventually probably have to decide whether European press freedom safeguards protect Julian or not, because he came to Europe for a reason. He actually came to the European Union for a reason. No one anticipated Brexit. But that was a European Union. And supposedly, because there are strong press freedom safeguards, because he was working together with Spiegel and Le Monde and The Guardian and so on. And it is shocking that the courts have so far in the UK failed to protect him in spite of it. So this case, I think, needs to be confronted to the United States every step of the way, everywhere. You are bringing this case against Julian Assange, and this case is an attack on press freedom in Germany, in France, in the UK, everywhere. They can't go around claiming to be the exporters of press freedom to the world when they have conjured up the most aggressive extraterritorial tool to not only inhibit but criminalize press freedom abroad and criminalize what journalists do for a living and what they have an obligation to do. Not only a moral obligation, but arguably a legal obligation. You possess evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, of murder against innocent civilians. You have to do something about it.
Absolutely. Any other question? Please keep your questions short so that we just have 5 minutes. We have one here. Another one there.
Okay, I have a question for Stella. Obviously, you are campaigning for your husband's freedom and for press freedom. Are you getting enough support from the European media, press, and so on?
I think there's growing awareness from the European press, and obviously this joint statement by The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, El País, New York Times was a very good sign. It came 3.5 years too late. And I think part of the problem has been a monumental confusion about the case. And that comes partly from the press itself, who early on was very keen to try to put a wedge between WikiLeaks and the rest of the press and say, oh, WikiLeaks is different, Julian's not a journalist, this and that. What's happened in the meantime is that the press has morphed into the WikiLeaks model. All what WikiLeaks pioneered with the anonymous Dropbox and the partnerships and encryption and so on, everyone has adopted, but because that was the only way to be able to conduct journalism in the internet age. So there's no meaningful, there never was, but there's no meaningful distinction. And then, of course, with the US case actually went after Julian and WikiLeaks as publishers. And I think the European media is somehow stuck in the mentality of 2010 when they didn't understand the technology. They saw Julian as a newcomer with strange techniques who was different. He was not part of the prestige media, and he was also highly admired and still is, and a household name. And don't underestimate the professional jealousy of these outfits. Who knows the name of the editor of Der Spiegel? Maybe you do, but you ask the average person on the street, they probably don't. And that wasn't the case with Julian and WikiLeaks. So the problem, I think, is partly this hangover of wanting to drive a wedge initially, and then a conceptual problem, which is that Julian has wrongly been described as a whistleblower. And this is really important to understand the distinction, because if you don't understand the distinction, you don't understand the implications of the case against Julian. They're going after Julian as a publisher and a journalist. They're not saying he's a whistleblower. They're not saying he's a source. And the legal implications are completely different. And the joint statement by these 5 partners, the Der Spiegel and so on, is finally coming to acknowledge that they went after Julian as a journalist, and the implications, therefore, for press freedom, for their right to publish, sets a precedent for them. And this has been a slow, unfortunately, a very slow process, and probably poor analysis in the beginning and a lot of egos. And the rest of the press in Europe, I think, is still slow to catch on this distinction.
Thank you. We have one last question from online people connected online, please.
So among all the comments and congratulations for the work and commitment of all of you, I will pick one question. Given that the CIA is able to dictate how Julian is treated if he ends up in a prison in the States, do the UK or US intelligence services have control over the conditions to which Julian is subjected in Belmarsh? And if so, how do we know how they're treating him there?
Kevin? Okay, fine.
It's not, you can't compare. What Julian faces in the United States is very specific to the United States. Julian is formally in the UK a remand prisoner, an administrative prisoner. He has all sorts of rights that in reality don't translate, because he's in Belmarsh, and that means he's treated like any other Belmarsh prisoner, and every Belmarsh prisoner is treated like a dangerous criminal, because some of them are. And in a prison, you basically everything kind of gravitates towards the mean and what's most efficient for the prison managers to manage the space and the relationships and so on. He's well, I'll let Kevin talk about the US.
Yeah, so I think that's a good setup, because in the United States, there is a designation that could be applied to Julian if he was put in detention, and also if he went through a trial and then was convicted. The Attorney General gets to put a kind of national security designation on Julian Assange that will restrict his communications, and he would lose the kinds of visitation privileges and the extent to which some of the things that he probably takes for granted in Belmarsh just because of the routine and how dull and the mental decline that he's undergoing, it actually can be worse in the United States. And there's an example right now that I cite because there's a whistleblower named Daniel Hale who exposed drone warfare under President Barack Obama, and he was sentenced to over 5 years in prison, but he was put in something called a communications management unit. And there's only 2 of these, but they're kind of like little Guantanamos in the United States. And you get put in there, and then you only have, let's say, 2 phone calls a week for 15 or 30 minutes. Or all of your mail is censored, and I wrote a letter to him. It took over a year for him to get my letter in prison. And he can't talk to certain people that I assume right now Julian might be able to communicate with, and it just becomes so much more restrictive in this setting. Oh, and there's non-contact visits. So basically, even if it was possible for Stella to uproot and have her family nearby wherever Julian was confined, he might not even be able to touch, kiss, hug, whatever, his children or Stella while he was in this facility. It is that inhuman, the way that they have constructed these facilities. And they have no security purpose. It's just the way that things have been constructed. So my closing statement is just to say that I think this law, we've had a really good discussion here about the Espionage Act and all of this treatment. We have to see this as lawfare, using the system against a person, and we also have to see this as political. These are political tools.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much also from my side, and it's a very important panel discussion, and thank you for being here. After this panel, we will watch the film Ithaka, so please, I tell everyone to stay here, don't go away. We will just do a break of 5 minutes. I really want to thank you deeply, and I think that we have to keep on the fight and also to support each other as network of trust. And for tomorrow, I remember that we have our workshops that you should not miss if you register, and maybe you can still register. So please remember to come here at 11:30. And I also take the opportunity, as usual, to announce our next conference that will be in June, since with this panel, we are closing the streaming because the film won't be on streaming. So I'd announce that our next conference in June will be in the 23rd and 25th of June, and it's called Artivism, the Art of Subverting Power. And so in this conference, we will speak about distributed technology and methods of provoking social and political justice using digital technology for artistic intervention, social awareness, and political criticism. So thank to the team of the Disruption Network Lab, to our technical team, thanks to everyone for being here.